In 1949, 4 years after World War II ended, an Air Force engineering team opened a sealed storage crate inside Wright-Patterson's forgotten basement archives. Inside it lay the scorched wing root sections of 6 lost B-17s, each marked with identical blast patterns no one explained during the war. The investigators noticed something chilling. Every aircraft, despite different missions, altitudes, and crews, burned from the inside out. And in each case, the fire started at the exact same location near the left wing root. Buried intelligence files revealed something even stranger. Captured Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly claimed that hitting the B-17 in that tiny spot guaranteed a kill, even though U.S. engineers insisted no such weak point existed. That single contradiction pulled the entire investigation back into the brutal winter skies of 1943, where American crews watched fortresses ignite in seconds, unaware that a hidden structural slot was betraying them long before any engineer understood why. To understand why every one of those wrecks burned in the same impossible way, investigators had to rewind the war to the winter of 1943, when the 8th Air Force was driving deeper into the Reich, unaware that a hidden flaw was waiting to ignite their bombers from the inside out. Back in those frozen skies, long before engineers ever suspected a structural weakness, the first warning signs were already appearing. In briefing huts at Thorpe Abbotts, Kimballton, and Bassingbourn, wall maps are riddled with colored pins marking missing aircraft. Crews are told that attrition is the price of daylight precision, that deep raids on Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Münster will inevitably draw flak and fighters. Yet the stories coming back from debriefs feel different. Veteran gunners describe ships that seem perfectly steady 1 second, and then, with a single muffled impact near the wing roots, erupt into sheets of fire that pour from bomb bays and waste windows. Pilots sketch what they saw on grease boards: a flash by the wing, then a fortress glowing from the inside, slowly peeling away from formation as if the airplane itself has turned against its crew. Early intelligence summaries hint at a pattern. Hits from 20mm MG-151-20 cannon shells ignite internal fires far more often than expected, and crews report the same unnerving moment. One flash near the wing root, then instant flames racing along the fuselage. Analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe compare these accounts with German weapon reports. The MG-151-20 is known to be lethal, but there is something unsettling about how predictable the sequence seems. Engineers blame ammunition volatility, fuel vapor, even crew exaggeration, yet the burning lanterns keep falling. Meanwhile, German pilots quietly note that a single well-placed burst into the wing root often lights up a fortress like dry straw. Far from the freezing contrails over Europe, in warm offices strewn with blueprints and test reports, a few officers begin asking uncomfortable questions. If the B-17 is as rugged as Boeing promised, why are so many of them not merely going down, but going down in flames? Inside U.S. command posts, the suspicion grows that something physical, some overlooked detail in the bomber's design, is silently helping the enemy. The air war over Europe is now a race against German industry, but for the men who study wreckage and red casualty lists, another race has begun. The hunt for a hidden flaw that may be killing their crews faster than the Luftwaffe can. In early 1944, the analysis moves from battlefield reports to metal. At Wright Field, Ohio, engineers walk the length of a battered B-17F returned from the European Theater of Operations, studying its skin like detectives at a crime scene. The aircraft's internal architecture, fuel tanks in the wings, oxygen lines snaking behind ribs, control cables passing through narrow junctions, has always been considered robust but predictable. Yet beneath the floorboards and behind removable access panels lies a maze that few combat officers have ever examined closely, a hidden anatomy of ducts, spars, and empty cavities where air and fire can move faster than any man. The fortress in front of them is scarred but intact. Patches of dark primer mark where flak once punched through. Between the starboard wing root and the fuselage, a ragged hole shows where a 20mm shell entered, and then, somehow, did far more damage than its size should allow. Ballistics experts recreate cannon strikes using captured German MG-151 rounds, firing at precise angles into mock-ups in retired airframes. They expect shattering impacts, fragments scattering in familiar cones. Instead, they see something unexpected. At certain grazing angles, the projectiles slip into a narrow gap where the wing meets the fuselage, a structural slot created by overlapping plates, rivet lines, and an unintended air corridor. High-speed cameras and smoke tracers reveal the full effect. Rather than exploding harmlessly outside or being stopped by armor plate, the shells skid inward like stones down a chute, following the slot's path directly into highly flammable zones. Oxygen manifolds, hydraulic lines, or the vapor-rich cavities around main fuel tanks. Test crews watch, unsettled, as small detonations deep inside the airframe produce disproportionate fireballs that roar back through inspection hatches and cable runs. The B-17's very strength, its complex, compartmentalized structure, has created tiny tunnels where fire can leap from one system to another. Suddenly, the mystery deepens. The secret slot is not a single obvious design blunder, but a geometric coincidence born of manufacturing convenience and structural necessity. It guides enemy fire exactly where it can do the most harm, while remaining almost invisible on paper. Meanwhile, returning crews in England continue reporting the same terrifying phenomenon. No warning, just an orange bloom, and a fortress turning into a lantern in seconds. For officers who grew up on Boeing's test footage of fortresses shrugging off punishment, the data feel almost heretical. If a tiny seam between wing and fuselage can turn German cannon fire into an internal demolition charge, then every assumption about ruggedness must be re-examined. Quietly, the order goes out. Find out how widespread this vulnerability is, and decide whether it can be fixed without halting the very bombing offensive it endangers. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. A single test shot changes everything. In a controlled trial, engineers fire a 20-emitter round at the wing root seam and watch it vanish into the airframe like a coin dropped through a crack. A second later, flame erupts from deep inside the fuselage. It is the exact sequence dozens of crews had described in hurried, shell-shocked debriefings after missions to Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. Suddenly, the phrase "burn from the inside out," once treated as emotional exaggeration, has a mechanical explanation. The discovery shocks even veteran structural experts. Up close on the hangar floor, the slot is a subtle irregularity, a shifting gap whose width changes as the wing flexes. Airflow tests in the wind tunnel show how slipstream pressure can drive oxygen-rich air straight through the seam, feeding any spark that reaches it. Combat conditions amplify its danger. At 25,000 feet, with crews breathing from oxygen systems and fuel tanks chilled but still venting, the interior of a B-17 becomes a pressurized ecosystem of fumes, wiring, and thin metal walls. A shell entering this seam bypasses armor plating entirely, detonating among lines that feed every crew position. Meanwhile, intelligence summaries from the 8th Air Force's intelligence sections add a disturbing human layer. Captured German pilots describe their own learning curve. They speak of attacks where long bursts into the fuselage seem wasteful, compared with short, aimed bursts at the wing root that produced instant fireballs. The phrase, "fortresses burn from there," passed along informally in Luftwaffe ready rooms, turns out to be battlefield empiricism built on hundreds of deadly encounters. At High Wycombe, analysts cross-reference damage logs, crash photographs, and search and rescue reports. Again and again, B-17s lost over central Germany show the same entry point, a scar near the wing root followed by catastrophic internal fire. Rarely do crews survive long enough to describe what happened in detail. Those who do speak of a dull thud rather than a shattering impact, a brief moment when nothing seems wrong, and then a rushing roar as flame races along the fuselage faster than any man can move. As the reports stack up on briefing tables and conference room desks, the fortress's aura of invincibility begins to fray. Its reputation was built on spectacular survival stories, aircraft limping home with tails shredded and noses blown open. Now commanders must confront an uncomfortable symmetry. The same complex, redundant structure that allowed some crews to survive has also created a hidden pathway that condemns others instantly. In the middle of a raging air war, the question is no longer whether the slot exists, but whether anything meaningful can be done about it in time. For the men charged with sustaining the bombing, offensive, that realization lands like a quiet verdict. The enemy has not found a mystical weakness. They have simply read, through trial and blood, what the metal itself was already telling them. Now the burden shifts to American engineers to answer back with more than faith in the fortress's legend. Before dawn at Kimbolton and Bassingbourn, line chiefs scrape frost from wing roots, unaware that their pre-flight inspections orbit the very flaw engineers now fear most. Floodlights glow off aluminum skins while ground crews top off fuel tanks and test turbochargers, the ordinary rhythms of another mission day. But in Dayton, urgency has taken over. In briefing rooms at Wright Field, engineers unroll drawings of the B-17s center section and propose a drastic solution. Reinforce the wing fuselage joint with internal deflectors, reroute oxygen lines away from known fire paths, and add fire-insulating baffles, all inside a bomber already stretched to its limits by weight and complexity. The challenge is brutal. Any modification must be strong enough to disrupt the incoming shell's path, but light enough not to rob the bomber of range or bomb load. Structural teams experiment with small wedge-shaped plates inside the wing root, designed to catch grazing impacts and throw fragments outward instead of inward. Others design metal shields and insulation sleeves around oxygen manifolds and hydraulic lines most exposed to the slot's trajectory. Test aircraft are stripped in cold hangars, while crews drill new rivet lines and cut access panels into areas never meant to be opened in the field. By February 1944, modification kits begin shipping to England. At depots in Burtonwood and other maintenance hubs, hangars fill with partially dismantled fortresses as teams cut into the wing roots, fit metal diverters, resheath oxygen ducts, and seal the slot with layered plates. Each airframe becomes a patient on an operating table. The work is painstaking and often miserable. Mechanics battle freezing temperatures, cramped spaces, and the knowledge that every hour spent on one aircraft leaves another still vulnerable on the line. Bomber crews anxiously track their serial numbers on chalkboards, watching to see whether their own ship will be upgraded before the next deep raid. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe reports begin to show faint ripples of confusion. Pilots accustomed to seeing fortresses explode after a short burst now encounter aircraft that shudder, trail smoke, and yet stubbornly maintain formation. Cannon strikes that once triggered immediate firestorms increasingly result in localized structural damage or clean exits through non-critical areas. The target has not vanished, but it has become less predictable, less cooperative with the physics of the MG-150-120. Yet the modifications alone cannot erase a year of losses or the images burned into memory. As winter turns to spring and the offensive shifts toward Big Week and the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe, commanders face a deeper question. The flaw has been identified and mitigated, but why was it missed in the first place? What else, hidden in blueprints and production shortcuts, might be waiting to betray the faith that air crews place in their machines every time they climb the ladder into a fortress at dawn? Smoke hangs over Oschersleben as investigators pick their way through wreckage scattered across frozen fields. Twisted spars, scorched aluminum, and fragments of U.S. insignia lie half buried in snow that is stained with fuel and oil. What they find in these grim jigsaw puzzles mirrors the engineering test back in Ohio. Oxygen lines charred through, insulation vaporized, and internal blowout patterns pointing back toward the same structural pathway near the wing roots. From a distance, each crash site looks unique, the product of its own desperate final minutes. Up close, the geometry of destruction is disturbingly familiar. The micro-hook emerges in the stark realization that these wrecks show how a few millimeters of metal shape reshaped the course of daylight bombing. Investigators from the 8th Air Force's engineering section photograph entry holes, trace fragment paths with grease pencils, and compare notes with Wright Field. Time and again, they see the same story written in torn wiring and blackened frames. A grazing hit at the wing fuselage joint, a flash inside the center section, and then uncontrolled fire racing along cable runs and ducting. The secret slot has turned theory into a field diagnosis. By mid-1944, statistical shifts confirm what the wreckage suggests. Fire-related B-17 losses begin to drop markedly in operational summaries from High Wycombe. Crews still face flak belts over France, aggressive intercepts by Jagdgeschwader units, and brutal winter headwinds. But the era of spontaneous mid-air infernos is waning. Veteran pilots sense the change at a gut level. Where once a single cannon burst near the wing could doom a ship instantly, fortresses now more often return home trailing smoke, hydraulics compromised but structure intact enough to reach the English coast. Yet the psychological impact lingers long after the numbers improve. Combat diaries from the 305th and 379th bomb groups describe a distinct dread that crews carried even after the fix. Memories of sudden lantern-like flashes marking where friends had fallen out of formation. In mess halls and Nissen huts, men recall specific aircraft by their nicknames and nose art, recalling how they saw them glow from within before breaking apart. For many, the knowledge that such a tiny structural oversight cost hundreds of lives is as haunting as any enemy action. As new B-17Gs roll off assembly lines in Seattle and Long Beach with corrected design features incorporated from the start, a quieter transformation begins inside the American war machine. Wartime engineers, once inclined to trust that combat experience would simply validate pre-war assumptions, start to question the very idea of battle-proven aircraft. The lesson written in flame across the skies of Germany is clear enough for anyone willing to read it. And it will shape how the next generation of bombers is conceived long after the last fortress leaves frontline service. The mini-hook lands immediately. A single overlooked seam had nearly undone the daylight bombing strategy. Now the question is, how many other invincible systems hide similar traps? At Wright Field in Eglin, engineers spread out structural drawings of the P-51 Mustang, the slab-sided B-24 Liberator, and the futuristic B-29 Superfortress, looking for any comparable geometry that might channel enemy fire into vital organs. The wing root slot on the B-17 becomes a case study in the danger of assumptions. Designers had focused on flak fragmentation patterns and armor penetration curves, not on the subtle path a shell might take once inside, helped along by airflow, vibration, and the layout of pipes and cables. Meanwhile, intelligence from crashed German fighters provides another angle on the same problem. Technical teams comb through wrecks of Bf-109s and Fw-190s brought down over Allied lines, measuring armor thicknesses and noting how German engineers concentrated protection around cockpits and fuel tanks. Debriefings of captured Luftwaffe pilots reveal how they, in turn, studied Allied aircraft in combat. They memorized weak points not from blueprints but from observation, where hits tended to produce fire, where bombers broke apart, which sections shrugged off damage. What began as tactical instinct, for example aiming cannon fire at the leading edge or wing root, turned out to be scientifically devastating once married to weapons like the MG-151-20 and Mk-108. By summer 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces begin to institutionalize the hard-won lesson. New testing doctrines require engineers to replicate oblique angle cannon strikes rather than simple perpendicular hits. Wind tunnel trials add smoke and tracer analogs to see how airflow might carry fire or debris into unexpected areas. Rather than treating structural complexity as an unalloyed strength, analysts now map every potential internal pathway for flame and fragments. The B-17's secret slot becomes a cautionary tale in training lectures and technical bulletins, a reminder that the enemy's learning curve can expose flaws faster than any laboratory. This shift reaches beyond bomber design. Ordnance experts re-examine how ammunition loadouts and armor kits are chosen for escort fighters and attack aircraft. Tactics officers reconsider formation spacing, attack angles, and even how damage is reported from the field, urging crews to note not just where they were hit but what failed first. An invisible feedback loop takes shape between frontline experience and engineering doctrine, closing the gap that had allowed the slot to remain hidden for so long. Yet the story is not complete. While the engineering response begins to reshape American air doctrine, the human cost carves the lesson deeper than any test report. Behind every revised blueprint and updated manual are names on casualty lists and empty spaces at mess tables. The next chapters of the air war will be flown in aircraft made safer by this reckoning. But the men who paid for that safety will always be part of its design. A micro hook sets the tone. Every fix written on a blueprint represents lives already lost. At Thorpe Abbotts, Grafton Underwood, and Ridgewell, surviving crewmen remember the sound more than the sight, a hollow thump near the wing root, a flash, and their aircraft turning into a rolling torch. For those who made it back, the memory of that sound lingers in the spaces between sentences during debriefs and in the long silences on off days when missions are scrubbed for weather. Waste gunners speak of heat rushing through the fuselage faster than oxygen masks can compensate, of plexiglass blisters suddenly glowing and then shattering inward as flames wrap around the aircraft. Radio operators recall struggling to keep systems alive long enough to send out mayday calls while insulation burned off wiring behind them. Pilots describe control columns that grow soft and imprecise as control cables, routed through the very center sections now under scrutiny, burn or seize. In some cases, men leap for parachutes through bomb bay catwalks, seeing their own shadows thrown high on the inside of the fuselage by the furnace blooming around them. After-action reports reveal how crews adapted even before engineers had fully understood the flaw. Some pilots quietly adjusted formation spacing to avoid flying directly over burning ships, fearing exploding fuel tanks or falling debris. Others experimented with shutting down or isolating oxygen lines during the worst of fighter attacks, trading the risk of hypoxia for a few extra seconds of fire protection. None of these measures are officially sanctioned. They exist in a gray zone of battlefield improvisation where survival comes first and doctrine follows behind. By the time structural modifications reach all active groups, many of the men most familiar with the B-17's fiery vulnerability have already rotated home or been lost. Those who do return carry stories that rarely appear in official histories. They speak years later of specific aircraft names and nose art, of the exact mission when they saw a fortress light up from within like a lantern and knew, without being told, that something in the design had betrayed its crew. For them, the later diagrams and engineering memos feel like a belated translation of a language they were forced to learn in real time. Their experiences become the emotional backbone of the engineering lessons that follow. Every reinforced seam and rerouted line carries with it an invisible dedication to the crews who paid the price for the discovery. As the air war grinds on toward its brutal conclusion, the memory of those burning fortresses continues to shape how new crews are briefed, how risk is discussed, and how much faith men are willing to place in the machines that carry them into combat. By early 1945, with Germany collapsing and bomber streams crossing the Rhine with near impunity, the B-17 flies in a form its earliest crews would barely recognize. Its structure is reinforced, its internal routing re-engineered, its hidden vulnerabilities finally understood. The aircraft now embodies a balance of strength and painful lessons, yet the ghost of the secret slot lingers in the way engineers speak about design and in the cautious respect pilots maintain for machines once trusted with almost mythic faith. The daylight bombing campaign that carried these fortresses over Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, and Berlin was built on a simple, confident premise: that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could endure enemy fire long enough to crush German industry by precision attack. For a time, the narrative seemed straightforward: heroic air crews and rugged machines battering their way through flak and fighters toward victory. The discovery of the wing root vulnerability complicates that story. It shows how a seam no wider than a finger, born of intersecting plates and practical manufacturing choices, nearly derailed a strategy measured in thousands of lives and millions of tons of bombs. In post-war years, as B-17s are sold for scrap or converted into survey aircraft and air tankers, a few examples find their way into museums. Visitors walk beneath their broad wings, read placards about famous missions, and study mannequins posed at waist guns and navigator tables. Most will never know that engineers once worried obsessively over the invisible paths inside those wings, tracing with their hands the routes that fire and fragments might take. For the veterans who sometimes stand quietly in front of these displays, the memories are sharper. They remember the lanterns falling through the overcast, the way a fortress could glow from within against a gray European sky. The legacy of the hidden seam is not one of blame, but of revelation. It underscores how even iconic war machines conceal delicate geometries that only real combat can fully expose, and how quickly the enemy will learn to read them. It also shows the capacity of a vast wartime system, factories, test ranges, depots, and frontline crews to adapt under pressure once the truth is seen clearly. Engineering drawings may capture dimensions and tolerances, but they cannot show the cost of discovery etched in burned paint and missing names on squadron rosters. As the war ends and the last B-17s glide home over a quiet Atlantic or sit silent on remote airfields awaiting their fate, the lanterns that once fell through the European sky fade into the distance. What remains is a final image. Engineers and veterans together, standing beneath a Yuri-Yornab preserved fortress, running their hands along the wing route of a parked aircraft. In that small gesture, fingers tracing metal where a hidden channel of air and steel once changed the fate of thousands. The story of the secret slot closes, leaving behind a quiet reminder that even the strongest designs demand humility from those who build them and those who fly them. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.